If you spill some water here, it'll eventually make its way to the Pacific Ocean. If you spill some water here, it'll eventually make its way to the Atlantic Ocean. But if you spill some water here, it'll end up in, one of the two. But you have no way of knowing which because, oopsie doopsie, you just spilled some water into America's most special river, North Two Ocean Creek in northwest Wyoming. Because while the Continental Divide forces every other river to pick a side and drain to one ocean or the other, this one manages to flow both ways, making it one of the most quietly exceptional places on the continent, and also, and I'm told this is the scientific term, a bicon. Water that falls in North America will eventually make it to one of four places: the Pacific Ocean, the Atlantic Ocean, the Arctic Ocean, or the Great Basin. And where a given raindrop ends up is based on which side of these lines, the Great Divide, the Laurentian Divide, and the Great Basin Divide, it falls on. Thanks to gravity, water that falls in this area eventually flows to the Atlantic, either directly or via the Gulf of Mexico or St. Lawrence. Water that falls up here goes to the Arctic Ocean, either directly or through Hudson Bay. Water over here heads straight to the Pacific, and water in here just kind of stays in here, and we're not going to get into the hydrology of that because it's not the point of this video, but it's an endorheic basin, which is like, you know, when roads have storm drains so rainwater can get out, but then there's also that random low part where the water never drains out and it just sits there after the rain stops and you see it and you're like, oh yeah, from last week? That's more or less what endorheic basins are. Because this whole system works by gravity, you won't be surprised that continental divides generally run through high elevation areas like the Great C D Continental Divide, which goes through the Canadian and American Rockies, then eventually the Andes in South America. But the Great Divide doesn't just follow some clean line through all the highest peaks. That'd be too simple. Instead, it's mysterious and invisible and not even a line. There are a few endorheic basins along the Continental Divide, so the line sort of widens around them since water there doesn't drain anywhere. It also widens around a couple lakes that straddle it and have outflows in both directions, namely Isa Lake and also somehow Wyoming, and another one called Committee's Punch Bowl in Canada, which, yes, means that if you spike Committee's Punch Bowl, you will also spike both the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans, which you should not do. Believe me, I've tried, and neither the fish involved or the US Fish and Wildlife Service like to party as much as I hoped they would. All this to say, draining to neither ocean, very much a thing. Draining to two oceans because you're a well-placed lake, not a common thing, but a thing. Being a river that sends a consistent flow of water to two oceans thousands of miles away from each other, very much not a thing, except for in the one random spot where it is. North Two Oceans Creek, which is presumably named after its founder, John Francis North Two Oceans, runs through Bridger-Teton National Forest specifically, and reaches an alpine meadow called Two Ocean Pass, which is presumably named after the fact that a creek there flows to two oceans. Here, at the so-called parting of the waters, the creek meets a rocky point in the land that sends a bunch of the water onward to Pacific Creek and a bunch on to Atlantic Creek. I wish I could tell you what these creeks were named after, but literally nobody knows. Which direction water randomly splashes towards at some rocks here will decide which of the two extremely long and extremely different journeys it will take. Water in Pacific Creek will eventually meet the Snake River, Snake Pass, Idaho Falls, then meet the Columbia River and walk the line between Oregon and Washington until it hits the Pacific Ocean, having traveled 1,353 miles or 2,177 kilometers to get there. Not to be outdone, water in Atlantic Creek will go to the Yellowstone River, then take a tour down the Missouri that passes Bismarck, Omaha, and St. Louis, then pour into the Mississippi and hit up Memphis and New Orleans before finally reaching the Gulf of Mexico, then the Atlantic. More than 2.5 times longer a journey than that weak sauce Pacific water took, with at least one extra gateway arch along the way and a lot more jazz. And here's something fun. If you draw a continuous line from the Pacific to Two Oceans Pass to the Atlantic, it cuts across the entire continent, meaning this whole chunk of North America is technically an island. So pour that pina colada, Saskatchewanians, you're on island time. Now, if you were to ask a civil engineer how hard it is to move water across the Continental Divide, they would break out into a cold sweat because the answer is very. Ever heard of the Panama Canal? Not an easy build. Ever heard of Colorado? Not an easy population to get water to. Because in Colorado, 80% of the rain falls over here, and 80% of people live, drink, shower, and cover their mountains in fake snow over here, and the Continental Divide runs between them, which is not convenient. So there's staggering amounts of infrastructure between here and there, canals, piping, whole shebang, just to get that water to these thirsty freaks. And designing and implementing all that infrastructure took decades and billions of dollars. Meanwhile, a dinky little creek does it all day long like it's nothing. And the whole situation gets even wackier in the spring when all of Two Ocean Pass floods and the water is deep enough that the fish can just casually swim from the Pacific watershed to the Atlantic. You know, the thing all those colonizers were so desperate to do a few hundred years ago. There may not be a Northwest Passage for cutthroat Europeans, but there is, as it turns out, one for the Yellowstone cutthroat trout, a fish that historically lived more over here and whose ability to somehow also be living in Yellowstone Lake was an ecological mystery until someone realized that they could have bopped over there through Two Oceans Pass some 14,000 years ago. So that's the one and only one river that flows to both the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. It breaks the continental divide, makes a mockery of our infrastructure, and solves our fish mysteries. Mysteries, whatever, it's cool. And you know what else is cool? This video's sponsor, Trade Coffee. What's your favorite thing about buying a cup of coffee? Is it that it costs like $8? Is it that you get a cool plastic cup to throw away immediately and feel bad about? Is it that the barista doesn't love you back? For me, it's just that it tastes good. And with Trade Coffee, you can have that delicious cup of coffee without all the indignities of the coffee shop. That's because they partner with hundreds of the best indie roasters in the country to deliver fresh, delicious coffee beans right to your door. They've got tons of information on every roast they sell, like the flavor profile, the roasting schedule, where the beans were grown, and most importantly to me, the name. This time my favorite name was Blendo Stupendo, which comes from Sterling Coffee Roasters in Portland, Oregon, and is indeed stupendo. Fresh, smooth, notes of chocolate, really good stuff. So if you want to skip the coffee shop, upgrade your morning routine with Trade Coffee. Right now, Trade is offering our viewers a free bag of coffee with any subscription at drinktrade.com/HAI, so sign up today.